make up that economy really are. And in his radio show, in his sermons, in his books, he's out there publicly speaking as a leader of the Riverside Church, using it as a forum to critique the same wealth and privilege whose gifts made possible the building of this church. Riverside Church was interdenominational, it was interracial, it was without a creed. And astonishingly for Baptists, it required no specific mode of baptism. At the heart of their ministry was reaching out into the community. It was reaching out and caring for the people in the community. The congregation moved and made a huge move to a much bigger building based on through gifts that were given by people like John D. Rockefeller Jr. $5 million back in that time, certainly a lot of money. He talks about that need for wisdom and courage for the facing of the hour if we're going to deal with all of the things that surround us and the culture that we're immersed in a healthy way. That's what really got my attention here. Isn't that the time in which we live? No, we're not stuck between two world wars and in the middle of a depression. Or at least I haven't heard that word saying officially we are. But yet, there's major financial turmoil, there's major chaos, there's major struggles in all different fronts, and our nation's divided and torn up into different parties and different groups, leaving us as a church to say, what is it that we are called to do? Who are we called to be? I saw somebody whose message today was going to be about, they were going to be focusing on whether it's right for the church, for the government to say whether you can have church or not, and who should set guidelines, and whose rules do we live by. All of these things that we've been pondering in different ways, but are being vocalized in different ways, is the frustrations of this pandemic continue as we try to find ways to live into a new world that's really unfamiliar. There's a lot that's been learned over the last few months. There are many of some of the strongest leaders. I've tried to just pick one or two leaders to follow. Carey Nieuwhof up in Canada is one I've mentioned before. Church leader, business leader, culture, brings a lot of people together that talk about life in the world today and faith in the world today. Some of the greatest speakers in the world, really. It's been fascinating to hear the one thing in common is that churches that are really finding themselves in a place of a really fast downward slide are those that are saying we have to get right back to the way it was as soon as possible. But that's not necessarily working out so well. And so that brings the next question of what's next? Well, how do you be online and how do you be in person? How do you do them both together? How do you do them in a church, in a small church like we are? How do you do that when you're not sure you have the gifts, talents, or even all the technology to do that? Well, certainly just like the rest of this journey has been, the only way it's going to be done is by the grace of God and by the gifts that God continues to provide us and to bring to life. And if we'll realize that some of those gifts may lie within us, that God calls us to step out in new ways and to use our energies and things we know from different areas of our life in different ways. But the one thing that just remains constant as I think about last week's message, I think about the first part of Romans 12, that familiar scripture we've talked about a lot this year of our minds being renewed so that our lives can be transformed, not just simply conforming to what anybody and everybody around us says, but allowing God to stir our minds in such a way that we can think things in a new way, which ultimately will transform our lives, which ultimately means we live life in a different way. So that should be simple. If our lives are transformed, we should easily know what that new life is like. Do we go online? Do we stay offline? Do we come to church here? Do we go to church there? But Paul paints a different picture, I think, of that transformed life as Romans 12 goes on. Hear these words that come from Romans 12, kind of the continuation of last week, if you will. Beginning at verse 9. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. I want to say that one again. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another and do not be haughty. Associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Here's the big one. Wait for it. If you're one of those who tunes in and out, just pay attention right now in this moment to this particular verse. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, and I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Powerful words to live by, powerful words that challenge the status quo. I hope, if nothing else, through all of this, we've learned how to be a little more patient with one another, how to realize that we can worship together even if things aren't perfect or as we want them to be. But by standing together and helping each other figure out what obstacles are getting in the way, we truly can provide for all the saints, for all of those that we're already connected with within the church, and to show hospitality to strangers. Certainly, we continue to look at new ways to extend that hospitality, to share the message in new ways. And that's why some of the links look a little bit different, and some different ways to get in through there. We continue to look at what that would look like. And that's why I ask again for your prayers, because it makes it very clear in chapter 12, verse 16, that if we're going to live in harmony with one another, we can't be haughty and we can't claim to be wiser than we are. And so I don't sit here today having all of the answers of what the future holds. And I know there's nobody else here among us who claims to be in that place, but we're committed to figuring it out. We're committed to trying to understand what it will mean to be the church in this next season of our lives as we move into the fall season that is always a season filled with change. And yet it's filled with more changes than ever this year. I still long for the day when I get the time to sit down and look at some of the footage from Carrie's cell phone over the last couple of years. The cell phone of those eggs that she's captured from the milkweed and brought inside and nurtured as they transformed into caterpillars, and as they grew and were nurtured and transformed into chrysalis, and as they silently, quietly hung there until they became monarch butterflies. The things that I've seen, the things I've observed, have really brought to life how deep that word transformation is. And what a process, an incredibly beautiful process that it is. And it doesn't mean that there's not struggle that goes on. They say if the butterfly doesn't have the ability and the time to struggle against that chrysalis and to break free, that ultimately they die because they can't force all of the fluids out of their wings. So therefore, you cannot do them a favor by cutting it open and setting them free too soon. But yet we don't see that struggle. We know they're in there. We can't wait for them to come out. There's a point where it's almost transparent and you can see what's going on inside. It's tempting to say, oh, just get out here and let me help, but you can't, as I mentioned before. Sometimes that growing, that renewing of our mind that leads to transformation, that's not just something that happens as a light bulb comes on or as a switch happens. While certainly that white bulb comes on that helps us to see things in a new way, to rethink what we've always thought before, but living into that refining that takes place to begin to apply that way of living in our life, that's where the work begins. That's where the work really happens. And when we watch transformation, things changing rapidly like that, paradigm shifts, all different language happening in people and organizations and communities around us, sometimes we can see the struggles that are going on and sometimes we can't. But sometimes in that very pushing against the struggle is what helps us to grow. It helps us to push all the stuff out of the way that's kept us from really being the people that God has called us to be. It's important to think about that. I felt this was one of those scriptures that kind of popped up in the lectionary at a divinely timed place. Because it's a powerful reminder that in a season that continues to be filled with more changes than ever, the need to be sincere in loving one another, in humbling ourselves and being willing to put the needs of others ahead of our own, and to, as it says, as far as it depends on us, to live at peace with others in a world that just seems to be longing for peace and no idea even where to find it. It's an important thing to remember, because we face not only the changes in the church, but the changes in our families, the changes in our schools, the changes in our communities, and even the changes in how we elect leaders, and maybe even how we treat one another as we do it. And so I pray that as God's people, who I truly believe, like Esther, we've been called for such a time as this, that we might live with our feet firmly planted in the gospel, and our hearts and minds truly open to the Spirit of God that is alive and well and moving among us, and not bound by time or space, that we might trust in a love that is given to us as a gift from God, that when we experience it, when we receive it, and when we learn how to express it and share it with others, the world cannot help but notice there's something different going on in this place. So to God be the glory for the great things God's been doing, for the great things God will continue to do, and for God's grace that will come alive in fresh, new, and exciting ways, and sometimes even in frustrating ways on the road that lies ahead. Our hymn this morning for our time of offering, and it comes from hymn 377 out of our hymn book, It Is Well. It's a familiar one, but it's always worth remembering the incredible depth of pain and suffering and trials and tribulations from which this word comes, from which this song comes. It reflects a faith that is coming alive in the midst of death and dying and the losing and loss of life and everything that you own, everything that you know as it is. So let's hear some thoughts from Horatio Spafford, brought to life by Tim and Vernita. It Is Well.